So there you were on the boat leaving Zasnitz, and you saw Tante Lisa waving goodbye.
That's right.
What were your thoughts then?
Well, we were all looking forward now to landing, and of course we landed at Getzer. I think it was in the dark, so we took a train right away to Oslo, which was at that time called Christiania. I still remember the streets or some of the streets of Christiania being paved with wooden boards, and we were in some hotel not too far away from the piers. I don't know how the logistics of all this worked out, because my mother took with her the big trunks, as well as, I still remember, all the feather beds in a huge bag like that, and how that was all transported and so on. How my mother coped with it, I don't really know to this day. But at any rate, in Christiania, in Oslo, we took the ship called Bergensfjord of the Norwegian America line. It was December, about the 15th or so of December, very cold. I still remember the ship docking near Bergen, didn't come into the harbor, but the little ship came out with passengers to our ship. And then after leaving Bergen and the Norwegian coast, we went straight across the ocean to America, landing first in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I still remember how our boat looked as though it had gone to the North Pole, because the ropes and ladders and everything were just enveloped in snow. And it was really quite a sight. The trip itself also was memorable. I remember when we were first taken on board, we went down into what seemed the hold, or fourth class or whatnot, very austere quarters, and I did not look forward to that trip. Then some officer came to my mother and said, "This is the wrong place for you, come and follow me." And he took us to the first class. So the whole trip was first class. I still remember the wonderful food in the dining room, but I also remember the shaking and kicking of the boat in high waves, so that we were close to, feeding the fish. But my mother and I too stayed out on board most of the time to breathe fresh air. I still can taste the soup which the steward brought us every morning at 11 or so, and
broth.
The broth. Borwin chose to stay in bed most of the time, and he was pretty miserable.
How long did the trip take?
I don't really know how we could sit out on that
deck
in
cold.
December weather. I just don't understand how we did it. But the closer we got to land, the more I recovered. And I guess we all recovered, and we started sitting in the lounge and play games, enjoy the meals and so on. And I still remember looking at the buildings in Halifax, and on many, I suppose, factory buildings, there were tanks, something like water tanks or whatnot, which to me was a very strange sight. Couldn't figure out why so many buildings had these tanks on top of the buildings. At any rate, from Halifax, the ship then went out to New York, and what I remember quite vividly was that the boat was met by a distant relative or maybe friend of my mother, Heini Schlatter, who had come to the pier to help expedite our landing and the transfer of our baggage and so on and so forth. We landed December 23, a day before Christmas Eve, and are you fixing something?
Why?
It distracts me.
I'm sorry, you landed what day?
On the 23rd.
23rd of December, one day before Christmas Eve. I also remember how we then took a taxi First, by the way, we had to pass inspection on board. Of course, again, the first class passengers were treated more expeditiously. But I remember how my mother told us boys to be sure not to cough when we went through inspection, because we might be sent to Ellis Island and then back home. Well, it all went quite smoothly. So we went in a taxi and stopped first at City Hall, where my mother and Lars went to get a marriage license.
Did you go to
During that time, we sat in that taxi all the time till they came out again. It must have taken half an hour or whatnot. It must have cost a pretty penny. At any rate, from there we went to Trinity Church on Broadway, and my mother and Lars were married there. And from there, all this by taxi.
Landing in New York and getting married and
Yeah, and I also remember we had lunch at a cafeteria near Trinity Church, I think it was. And what impressed us boys most was that on each table there was a
jar of sugar.
a bowl of sugar, of which one could take as much as one wanted, which for us boys from Visma was utterly unbelievable. At any rate, from there we took the taxi to the station, and the train journey took us that same evening to Poughkeepsie, New York. And even right there on that first encounter, my father asked my mother, "Did you bring the piano?" And she said, "Well, no, of course not." And Lars had a fit right then and there, scolded her for
How
not
she could have
bringing
brought the piano.
It's beyond me. At any rate, we landed.
Did he play?
No, but he
loved to hear her play.
wanted to hear my mother play, which she did sometimes. At any rate, we landed, stopped at Poughkeepsie, and a taxi took us to a hotel called Bellevue Hotel, I think, on Market Street, the central street in Poughkeepsie. And what I remember there is that during the day, next morning, we sat in rocking chairs in front
On the
of
porch.
big windows looking out on the street, and people walking on the street, of course, looked in at us as though we were monkeys in a cage and made fun of us. And besides our chairs, sitting in the rocking chairs, were spittoons. And I imagine that some of the men used those spittoons to spit into. At any rate, we sat there all day while Lars went out to the farm in Hyde Park, New York. And he was getting that farmhouse ready for us to come to that same evening. Finally arrived, and we went in some taxi first to the village grocery store and piled up the car with huge cartons of food, so that we hardly had any room in the taxi. And then the taxi went on and on and on in the dark. My mother thought, where are we going? It must be way out in the country, which it was. Finally landed in front of a house. Couldn't make out really the character of the house in the dark, but came into the front door, and I thought, oh, well, this is great. This is the veranda. That's good, or porch, or whatever it is. It's very spacious. But that was the living room, and very poorly finished it was. Pictures, photos which we have show the ceiling with all kinds of spots and so on, and big stove stood in the corner. No furniture. The furniture had arrived that day from the department store and was piled up in the master's bedroom, if you can call it master's bedroom, in the bedroom. So it was all pretty bleak. And we were greeted by two Norwegians who were fellow workers or friends and colleagues of Lars, who were his workers building houses in Poughkeepsie and environments. Yes, these two Norwegians lived upstairs in a just tiny more or less unfinished room with slanting ceilings, and it was all very primitive. There were no electric lights, no running water, no central heating. Farmhouse, but Lars had procured a Christmas tree, and we hung on it what we had brought with us in our suitcases, including Norwegian flags from the steamer and whatever little trinkets we could find to enliven our arrival.
So all of this was the day after arriving?
This was Christmas Eve.
The day after
the day before you arrived at
day
New
before
York
we
Harbor.
arrived, and this was the next day, yes.
Oh.
Next morning, I think, was a Sunday morning. Well, by the way, the Norwegian, what was his name? Forget, he played the fiddle. He had made a bunch of pork chops. That was the dinner for the evening. I don't know what else there was with the pork chops, but he made them I think in a very crude fashion. But for us children, it was all very wonderful, very exciting. We couldn't wait till next morning to see really where we were and what the surroundings were. My Lars had told us children that there was a brook on the property, and we would just have great fun playing around with it all. So next morning, I still remember, Borbin and I sneaked out of the house and walked down the dirt road to a little creek. That seemed very nice, but Lars told us afterwards that wasn't the creek, but the real creek was down the end of the property where we could fish and wade around, so on. The farm was 13 acres, was not being worked, just gone to wilderness more or less. There were a couple of swamps. They really were not ponds. But being in a strange land, and for us boys, it was all very wonderful just to experience these new surroundings. The farm was actually in East Park, not Hyde Park, and far away from stores or church or school or anything. I started going to school after a few days in the country. It was a one-room schoolhouse with maybe about 40 students in all, for all grades, first through the 8th grade.
How many teachers did you
And I
have?
had to walk about, I think, close to 4 miles each way to get to that school.
Really?
And these 40 or so students in 8th grade were commanded by or taught by 2 teachers, one in front for the first 4 grades and one in back for the last 4 grades. I was put into the 4th grade, even though I was 13. I should have been further ahead because of my English or lack of English. And that was a problem from the start. But I had some words from my English course in Wismar, but to hear people talk was a different story altogether. I could say words myself, but I couldn't understand the American pronunciation.
Right.
And I had a dread of finding or running into an American, maybe the mailman or somebody else, who might say something to me, and I would just say, I do not understand, I speak German, or something like that.
Did Borvin speak English?
Oh, about the same thing.
So he was in 6th grade in the school?
He was not sent to school at all anymore, because he had not done too well in Wismar, and my mother thought that it wouldn't do any good to force him to school. Since he was 15, she thought he could start working, find a job, which we did, or which he did. So I attended that school for about 6 months. Finished off with the 8th grade at the end of the 6 months. I remember that so well because we had to take what's called the Regents examination, which was given to, or which had to be taken by everyone who graduated from grade school.
Is that still true in
Yes.
in New York?
Is that so?
Yes, the Leeds and Success.
Concentrated.
Well, I've only heard bits and pieces of these stories, and this is the first time I've heard the whole story in one.
Well,
Tell
yes,
me.
that's. I think that serves a
So I
good
never
purpose.
put all the pieces together exactly right.
Yeah. Is it going now?
Yes, sir.
Oh. Well, to continue the discussion of life in Hyde Park, New York, life was not very easy, especially for my mother, partly because of the primitive conditions of life in this austere, undeveloped or underdeveloped house. Very small rooms, unfinished kitchen, and I said no running water, no gas, no electricity, no telephone, of course. No neighbor even. The first neighbor was about 15 minutes away. But what was worse, not so much these conditions, but what was worse was Lars' instability and his continuing outbursts over often absolutely trivial issues, so that my mother, I know, was very unhappy. He also had a habit of running up bills in his business as builder of houses, but also as a consumer at the grocery store and so on, buying many things which we children thought were unnecessary luxuries, including lots of tobacco and pipes and so on. And I frowned to him and to my mother that he spent money on such things. Well, but no doubt he meant well, and I'm sure he thought it was outrageous for us children to question his economic habits. But he did run up a big bill with the grocery store, and after we left next year or so, we heard that the grocer caused the farm to be foreclosed because my stepfather had run up maybe $800 or $1,000 bills and couldn't pay them, so he lost the farm. But another aspect of life in Hyde Park stands out more vividly and happily, and that was the loneliness in the rural environments where one could walk around in the forest, in the woods, and along the creek, or by a fish pond, where I enjoyed hearing the bullfrogs and watching turtles and so on. Caught a big eel on one occasion, so on. So that we developed a real love for nature, pretending sometimes we were coming from another continent and for the first time exploring the wilderness and making a settlement here and there. Sometimes just imagining that no one had ever walked in these woods before. It was all new to us, and of course among other surprises was the growth of flowers and berries and other things that we had not seen in Europe, which were different here. One phenomenon which puzzled us very much were these huge flies which would settle on a peach tree or so, and on one occasion I took my handkerchief and caught one, and it turned out to be a cicada, something that one couldn't see in Wismar, of course, and various other forms of flora and fauna. So the deep sense and deep love for nature was really developed in that environment.
How long did you live in Hyde Park total?
I think it was about a year and a half. My mother became very ill, had to go to the hospital with laryngitis or whatever it was. But there were scenes sometimes which were just very alarming and arousing. When one night my mother was heard crying, and she walked out of the house in her nightgown in the bitter January cold. I just developed a dislike or even a hatred for my stepfather. Sometimes I think I did everything I could to antagonize him further in order to bring about a break. And finally that break came when my mother decided that for the sake of her children it was better to go away, separate from Lars. And since she had a distant cousin in Detroit, she thought she had a connection which she could use for our going there and starting life afresh. So we eventually, that was in around Thanksgiving time, 1926 I think, that we arrived in Detroit, where we were greeted by Tante Minnie, Aunt Minnie, and her husband Theo Hug. He was a druggist, and the sign on his drugstore was "Hug the druggist."
That's a good one.
That's great.
At any rate, we've gotten to Detroit, and probably would have liked to mention various other things, but don't want to make it too long.
All right. Shall we sign off
So we,
this evening?
yeah, let's start out
Pick up in
afresh.
Detroit, 1926. Next
Yeah.
time.
Well, there are many more things to say about the one-room schoolhouse, and another thing that we developed, which we never would have in Wismar, and that was love of cats. Because of our loneliness, my mother's loneliness especially, she became terribly fond of a cat, which was of course a wonderful pet. Sat on her lap during meals and with the paws on the table, and every once in a while would get a little bite. Something that was unthinkable in Wismar, because one disliked cats there mostly, and here turned out to be a close friend. That cat was called Hindenburg for some reason, and had 3 kittens. And as I told you yesterday, on one occasion the mother cat came back with a baby rabbit, then with a second, then with a third baby rabbit. And finally,
This was in Detroit?
no, this was now back in Hyde Park
Oh,
Farmhouse. Finally, she came back with the mother rabbit, full-sized rabbit. Laid them all at the door, the gray cats do, you know. And we snatched away the big one and had it for dinner.
That's funny.
How long did you live in Hyde Park?
On the farm,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was about a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, there were 2 swamps, or not ponds, but very swampy ponds. But one thing I remember was that there was the noise or cry of a heron,
Oh.
and we discovered the nest of the heron about this big on one of those grass tufts in the pond. You know how sometimes a pond has these what would you call them?
Little islands.
Little islands with long grass on there, and the heron herons had their nest there. It was very amazing, so close to the house.
And then?
And of course, I had to walk to school every day, 4 miles or so, past several farms, and I was dreading certain farms that had big dogs coming rushing out at me and barking fiercely. I really trembled every time I had to walk past those farms, but I had to morning and afternoon. There was no way to get around it. That was also my first encounter with blacks, because there was one black farmer in the school district who sent his boys, I guess they were all boys, to this school, and I just had never known that there were Negroes in America. There was a totally new phenomenon.
What was your reaction?
And sometimes at lunchtime we'd sit together and talk, and these Negroes, of course, had no idea whatsoever what Germany was, or Europe for that matter. And they kept asking me, do you have cows in Germany? Do you have horses in Germany? Do you have chickens in Germany? And so on. Just the most primitive, curiosity.
Well, what was your impression of them?
Well, somewhat strange children, strange kids, as I thought, but nothing very special. I didn't sense any animosity. I just felt, well, there they are, but I had nothing to do with them. Yeah. But the education we got in that one-room schoolhouse was quite solid, systematic, and the discipline was very strong. There was no disorder and rebellion and so on. Just unquestionable authority of the teacher, except she wasn't authoritarian at all. It just came that way because kids were brought up to mind the teacher, study, stay in school, and so on. So I got my basic American information, history and geography and so on from that school, and some of that I retain to this day.
Wish we could do the same with the budget that they had back then.
Which always convinces me that it doesn't take much money to provide a good education. It just takes qualified, good teachers, takes discipline, and takes at least obedience on the part of children to do their assignments, if not actually zeal to do their work. So it was a good experience. And the long walk in rain or shine or snow or blizzard and so on didn't harm me, except what I did enjoy and in fact look forward if a car came by and stopped and said, do you want to ride? And I said, yeah, I do. And these cars were usually Model T Fords, sometimes driven by a farmer lady, and I felt so privileged when she stopped and picked me up.
I can imagine.
Sometimes the milk truck would come by and he'd pick me up. In fact, the road on which I walked, all dust roads of course, to school was called Milk Street, because that was the milk route.
Now this is south of Poughkeepsie?
One thing I remember also, it's sort of east, north of Poughkeepsie. Hyde Park is north. You take the highway along the Hudson right up to Hyde Park. And then at Hyde Park there's a little village, and you take a road to East Park, to the east, to the right. But one thing I also remember in Hyde Park, now I've forgotten it. That's all I remember. Was something fundamental, but I've forgotten it now. It'll come back to me.
The woods,
Well, that, yes.
the bird songs.
They were all different. The sounds of birds and animals and so on were all different. An animal I had never encountered in my life was a woodchuck. And we had a woodchuck on the farm, and I always walked alone on the farmland or in the vicinity. I enjoyed that closeness to nature and observed the animals, and especially this woodchuck. Quite a big thing, about as big as a beaver or so. But our cat would stalk the woodchuck every once in a while, and they'd get into a fight, but she didn't bring home the woodchuck. That was too big a animal.
Where was Borwin, meanwhile?
But Borwin got a job, a series of jobs. One was at an ice house where they stored ice from a pond to be sold in blocks because people didn't have any refrigerators. They bought the ice from the grocery store, and Borbin was at this place, a kind of a big barn where they stored the ice. I don't know what he did. I hope he didn't have to lug the big ice blocks from the pond to the barn. But whatever he did, it was very plain, unskilled work, of course. Well, that's all he could do. And later on, he got a job in a pants button factory, Dutchess County Pants Company, or something like that. Also totally unskilled. But it forced him into a work routine and discipline, which I suppose didn't hurt him. But he never went back to school.
So he completed only, what, 7th grade? in Germany?
Well, he left Wismar at the age of 15, and he left in the same class that I left, because he had gotten stuck a year or so in his grade, so that while he should have been ahead at least one grade, he was actually, when we left Wismar, in the same grade that I was. But not in the same classroom, because there were 2 sections.
That was 7th grade, approximately.
It was called Untertertia, which is, I can't equate that to our system. It's about the 4th year of secondary school, which would be plus grammar, 7 years. 4 years of grammar school, actually, would be equal to what? 8th grade? Yeah, about 8th grade. Well, whatever. Are we still on? Oh, we are.
Shall I wrap it up?
Yeah, you can wrap it up now. Mother's falling asleep. Don't blame her because I'm so soporific.
Yes, the light bothers you,
Oh, no, it doesn't.
doesn't it? I can hardly keep my eyes open because of the light.
I was going to tell you something more. What was it? Well, Borbin started indulging in his fancies. He fiddled around with mechanical things such as ventilators. We had the stand of one of those ventilators you use for wells on farms. Well, what would windmill, kind of a windmill. He fashioned a wheel to go with that. That was one of his early inventions, I suppose one could say. And also he went to the public library in Poughkeepsie once in a while and brought home Nietzsche and other heavy material like that. And my mother shook her head and thought, Borbin, das geht doch nicht, das kannst du doch nicht verstehen. And I looked at it myself, and it was full of Greek and Latin quotations, and I thought, my brother can read that? I had great respect for my older brother all those years.
Could he understand Nietzsche?
He seemed to be ingenious. I don't know. He was in the midst of adolescence, and he thought that some of this philosophical literature was interesting.
Is that kind of like Beethoven phase?
It could have been. Well, I was much older when I had that phase. I was about 21. But it could be something similar. So my mother separated from Lars. It was another terrific decision for her to make after having made the decision to take us from Wismar and live with Lars, marry him. So they broke up, and went up to Detroit. And only several years later, I think about 1931, my mother had the marriage, not annulled, divorce carried out to divorce from Lars in absentia. Didn't know where he was, had just disappeared. So she had to get a divorce in absentia. I don't know if that's how one does that. And because she separated from him in 31, she was really my only guardian. So that she became an American citizen in 1931. And since she was my only guardian, I derived my American citizenship from her in that same year. So I never went through the citizenship process or examinations or anything like that. I just automatically got it from my mother because I was still under 21, a minor. Time for bed.
That's what? It's time. Have you
Do you
turned it
want-
off?
Shall we take the train to Detroit?
It's time now, yes.
Or do you want to take the train to Zurich?
Either way is fine.
I think it's time. I think it's a little too late for playing.
Alright,
Still
we'll
great.
save it for the morning.
Because
Will you have time in the morning?
I have to get up early in the morning.
He has to leave for 8:30.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I have to leave at 8:45 in Hyde Park, which was a 12-cylinder Packard and sedan. And he had the whole sedan passenger section cut off and replaced by boards so as to have a truck.
Wow.
So he drove in this 12-cylinder Packard truck around the place, which consumed gas, of course, on a big scale, which didn't matter in those days. And then there was on the property an old overland, Willis Overland Road. Do you remember those?
Yes, of course.
I used to have a Willys.
You did?
Yeah, I had
Willys
a
Overland.
57 Willys station wagon.
For heaven's sakes, I didn't know he still made them.
This car was an open car with the canvas flapping in the wind, just torn to bits,
The top.
and the top, the canvas top, just flowing in the wind, and the entire body was rusted, so the car looked brown. I never have seen in all my life a car that was rusted all the way around. And then there was still another, just the frame of the chassis of I guess it was also a driver's seat of another Packard on the ground, and I would go and sit in that and drive from town to town and road to road playing, that was a bus or I was a train or whatnot, just the way that 16-year-old did in New York. Loved it. But I was very embarrassed when people came and saw that rusty car or saw this peculiar Packard truck. And we learned that neighbors, they weren't very close neighbors, but whatever neighbors they were, stayed away from us because they didn't like
They didn't want to rust.
didn't like this foreigner living in that queer house with that.
Well, it's because he was yelling all the time.
No, he wasn't always yelling. He just became red in the face, and I still remember him saying, "Brauchst nicht, also, brauchst nicht, also." In other words, you don't need to tell me, you don't need to say so. All these words that stick in my mind to this day.
But
But
was
I
he a
was-
heavy drinker or what?
No, not at all. He smoked pipe, corn cob pipe, all very frequently.
Does that belong to the VCR?
Oh,
No, that's a microphone.
It is.
I'll throw that out.
he was immensely strong. He took us two boys, one in each hand, and then pivoted around as though he were a carousel. And we boys just thought this is a giant who can do this. Or sometimes I'd climb right up on his shoulder and be carried around. So when he was in a good mood, we loved him. He did things for us. In Wismar, he tied a rope from the top of the roof to the pear tree in the garden, and then a rope suspended from a, wheel of some sort, so that when we got with that rope around us, we jumped off the roof and went all the way across the garden to the pear tree.
Wow, that's great.
Oh, what a thrill.
Like a pulley?
A pulley, that's right. He called it a Seilbahn.
That's great.
Yeah, he did things for us. And when we were and looked at the garden and back, we saw that metal fence around the garden with steel pipes and wire in between. That he made himself too. Did all kinds of useful things. He built the kitchen in the as a sort of emergency kitchen for our apartment in Wismar, because we had to take in more tenants.
And when we went back to Wismar, when was it, 73?
The 73, the first
and went
time.
through the old house, the wiring that he had put in was still there, the same wiring that he had put up. When they had gas lamps and had installed electricity into the house, he had run wires around, and those wires were still in the same relationship.
He worked with unbelievable thoroughness. Took him forever to get anything done, but he was so thorough, and that was his undoing in his building, because it took too much time. He just couldn't finish the job on time and got into trouble. But the work he did was very solid, finished. After all, he was academy trained and really highly trained person. When he did these things, he did a first-class job. But he didn't get things done. And, some things around the house, for instance, to just put a cement floor down for the back porch, never got around to it. Various other projects he kept saying we'll have it done by that time and so on. Never got them done. And as I say, inside the kitchen didn't have any finished walls, but just the plaster boards, these laths that you find in barns or so. Never got that properly done. Oh, and when he went into debt, he borrowed some money from a German florist in Poughkeepsie, several $100s worth, I guess. Couldn't repay it. So, the florist had demanded a, a
deposit of some kind.
deposit, and so my mother had to deposit her silver.
Her wedding silver.
Her wedding silver with this florist. And since Lars wasn't able to repay him, he kept the silver, and my mother was, of course, very upset about that. Until finally, one day, Tante, what her name was, Uncle Heine's late wife, Frau Schlatter, came out, and she was a businesswoman. She knew how to get along with people, and she went to the German florist and said, now this isn't really right. You took the property of the wife, but it's not the wife's debts that you have, but the Lars's debts, and that silver should be returned, and they returned it. Goodness knows where it landed finally.
May probably has it now.
May had it, At any rate, those are episodes, part of the life in those days. Of course, in Hyde Park, New York, we weren't at all aware of the kind of ambiance we were living in. This was not really Hyde Park Estates that we were living on or near, but just farm territory east of Hyde Park. Hyde Park is on the Hudson, and it has very beautiful aristocratic estates, including those of
Roosevelt.
FDR, Roosevelt. Yes. Never saw those in those days. And when we went back, Mother and I, to visit the farmhouse, we saw it again in when was it? Was that the trip we took to Salak, the book Salak?
Yes, that's
well,
right.
Then that must have been around
1980 or so.
No, yeah, I think about 1979 or 80. We found the house again. Was a little added to, but still recognizable. And we walked inside, and the ceiling seemed to be just about my head's height. It's just so low.
We knocked on the door and asked if, and said that Carl said he had lived there when he was a child, and so they let us come in and see the whole house. And it wasn't very different from what it had
It
been.
wasn't terribly different, no. Well, of course, the walls were finished, and it was furnished properly, and so on. But it was a primitive life. But as I say, those conditions were not so serious for us as was the strife, the disharmony in the house. And we were always happy to be alone when Lars was away. But in retrospect, I sort of feel sorry for him because he undoubtedly meant well, just couldn't control his temper sometime. And I, in particular, was to blame for trying to increase the tension between them, because I began to dislike him so much that I thought we wanted to go away and should go away. And I think my mother sensed that and so decided to make the break. But we had nothing to go on. We went to Detroit, had no house, no jobs, no money whatsoever. It's just incredible.
How did you get to Detroit?
Well, I think my mother scraped up enough money to pay for the train fare. And then when we were picked up by Tante Minnie and her husband, druggist Hug, we stayed at their little bungalow in Detroit, outside Detroit. Also rather modest conditions, but average for those days. And so we went, well, my mother went hunting for a house in Detroit and finally found an apartment upstairs in a small house too, on the east side of Detroit for, I think, $25 a month, something like that. Slanted ceiling in every room, and there were only 2 rooms, and a kitchen. I think the whole thing was just carved out of the attic in earlier years in order for the owner to get an income from the second floor. It wasn't really a genuine second floor. It was probably a former attic. At any rate, very primitive quarters, but we couldn't afford anything better. $25 a month or so those days. And there was no bathroom. It's just a toilet carved out of the kitchen. That is, one corner was boarded off with primitive wooden boards. The toilet was there, so that in the kitchen one had no privacy whatsoever.
But when you think of the courage of his mother, who had lived in this town where her family had lived for hundreds of years, they were all well known. She had been brought up so gently and with all kinds of luxuries and attention and so on.
Yeah, upper middle class.
Carrying through this primitive kind of existence in a strange country. It's really remarkable what she...
Yeah, and with no resources at all.
It's unbelievable.
Yes.
Well, we immediately enjoyed the support of people in Detroit. When I went I was sent off to high school, my first year in high school, and I took a course in German literature. The teacher, Fräulein Mühlmann, Miss Mühlmann, was so excited to have a real German come to school after World War One, because during World War One, Germans were not liked in America.
Well, it's amazing that they taught German, because in Nebraska they stopped all German instruction.
Yes, I wonder when they...
University and in high schools.
Yeah, well, but for how long did that ban continue?
Well, it lasted for a long time.
This was now about
In the 20s.
1927, probably.
Oh, well,
when we got
maybe
to
it was.
Detroit. At any rate, she had exerted herself to help us with clothes, second-hand clothes, and some food, and so on and so forth. And since, all of us got jobs through recommendations from either from her or from other teachers in school. Borbin was given a job at in the public school department, or Department of Education, raking school yards or doing yard work at various schools. And my mother got a job in school lunchrooms, which not only brought in a little money, but also a can full of soup or food that she brought home from the school cafeteria. And I got a job in the department store as a wrapper for $10 a week. And that job I got through a recommendation from the teacher who taught salesmanship in the high school. A round little lady, very friendly, and just befriended me in such a generous manner. She always pulled out a 3x5 or 5x7 card and said Carl Gustav, Anthon, or whatever it was, highly recommended, and then her name. So that's all she had to write, highly recommended. And I walked with that down to the department store and said, I'd like to talk to the employment office. Okay, go in here. So there'd be a man his name was Mr. Middleditch, I still remember. And I handed over this, and I would say something to the effect, my teacher told me I should come here and get a job, or something like that. It's amazing that they didn't, well, you just better go right back to school and do your work. At any rate, I was given a job from 12 to closing time, 6:30 or so, as a wrapper. And at school I was given, first of all, courses to finish by 12 or even 11:30, I guess. And I was given a free pass to the cafeteria to get a lunch up there. All alone, nobody got up to the lunchroom yet. I was there just alone.
You were the pet.
I was the pet because the ones who served me there, and especially the cashier, I still remember her today. I came with this tray of food and so on, and she would say, no charge, how are you today, and so on. Such privilege, just incredible. And the principal gave me his overcoat. I still remember the very fine, heavy, warm, gray overcoat that he gave me. Mr. Mann was the principal. Very, almost lordly type, master, man of great authority, but at the same time also human warmth and kindness towards me too. And those were all lovely experiences with these human beings.
What did you think of the rest of the kids you went to school with?
Well, I was a bit alienated by the rough tone that some of them indulged in, especially with regard to sex and other matters. That really horrified me. Something that I never encountered in school in Germany.
Did you have any good friends at high school?
I had one or two pretty good friends. girlfriend, not really girlfriend, but a German girl, that is second generation German. What was her name? Well, I don't remember now. I still see her in my mind's eye. She was taking German literature, so I was always very excited when I was near her in class or out in the hall. And I remember sometimes I stood in the hall, sort of hiding behind a pillar, to wait till she would come by, just not to then talk to her or anything, just to see her. It was exciting. Oh gosh, her name just escapes me, but she's probably in one of my diaries upstairs in the attic. And there was a girl, Josephine Stern, from a fine family living on Grand Boulevard. And I told her I loved to play the piano. She said, well, do you have a piano? And I said, no, I don't. Well, we have a grand piano at home. Would you like to come and play on it? And I was so thrilled to be taken into this, what seemed to me, very wealthy house with a black grand piano. And I sat down rather gingerly playing some Chopin prelude or something like that.
Where did you learn to play piano?
Well, I played in Wismar already. I had piano lessons from 3 or 4 different teachers. One teacher was the niece of Humperdinck, Frau Schröder.
Grandchild from
A niece
a niece.
of Humperdinck. No, what the connection was, I don't know. That's what one said. At any rate, she was the wife of an eye, ear, nose and throat doctor to whom I went for weeks with an inner ear infection. That bothered me a long time in my youth. The right ear had middle ear infection. And on one occasion it had to be operated on, so that my mother took me to Rostock. Remember where Rostock is? Yeah. Where there was a clinic that specialized in this sort of thing. So I had it done. I think I'm all right ever since. At any rate, I had another piano teacher in the person of a Latvian refugee. See, there are a lot of these Latvians refugeed out of Russia when the communists took over, and many of the aristocrats were executed by the communists.
She was mother of that.
She was the what do you call it? Took care of the children. What do we call such a person?
Governess?
Governess. Yes, I think that would be their name, the term for governors of 6 or 7 children. But that's in Wismar now. That's we're not talking about America. In Wismar, my closest friend was a Balt, that is a boy from a Baltic family whose parents had been shot. And we became very close friends, very affectionate friends, really. Georg von Wildemann was his name.
That's how you can remember all these details.
Well, I have diaries which have still lots of reference to these things. Kept a diary on the farm and in Detroit and so on. Well, the more one thinks about it, the more details come up.
Yes.
Don't they?
That's right. Seeing the pictures bring a lot of
Oh.
remembrances back.
Oh gosh, yes. Well, Borwin, just by accident, got into this career of restoring. He stood at a store window in Detroit, looking at some pictures or frames or what it was, and some man came by and they started talking. And the man said, well, if you're really interested in framework or woodwork, so why don't you come and do the I guess he said,
Restoration?
go to the laboratory, the studio of Herr Zuhr in the Institute of Arts, because they need a man to do woodwork. And so Bobbin went there, and apparently he impressed Zuhr to the effect that Zuhr thought, well, he could be a good help, or be an apprentice, as it were. And for several months he did woodwork, framework. And finally he took to brushes, and Zuhr had a good talk with my mother on one occasion, I remember, where she asked him what could happen to Bobbin in the way of career, what should one do, and Zuhr assured her he would train him in the craft of restoring. And I still remember the comment he made about himself. He said he feared that someday Bobbin might be a competitor, and he said, ich züchte mir eventuell eine Schlange auf dem Busen. Can you imagine
Well, he
saying
was
that?
German, was he?
Yes, he was German.
What does that mean?
Oh, I might grow a snake on my chest by training Bobbin, and someday he'll be a competitor, which of course is what turned out to be. Not that Bobbin competed with him directly, but he became an independent restorer in New York. Did very well. But just by accident again, he might have just ended up with a bunch of odd jobs, having no schooling. And here, just by this kind of accident,
But Borwin read very widely. He was very well read.
yes,
He was kind of self-educated,
yeah.
so that his information wasn't really very well organized. But he had lots of interesting ideas and lots of information.
I am getting tired. So, if you don't mind,
Not at all.
because I've got to get up early.